My grandparents were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, who lost everything except my mom and an aunt. And they, after the war was over, they eventually made it to the United States. And my mom was the only one in the family who could speak any English, and she enrolled herself in the New York City public schools. She graduated from Hunter College High School in New York, and my parents' education meant everything to them. They were able to restart the business that they had in Warsaw and build a new life here in this country. And my mom was able to become, an American citizen, really learning what she learned in the public schools. So they put a huge priority on it. And then when I was in the second grade, I was diagnosed with dyslexia. So I ended up having to do the second grade over again. That was a painful experience. But because of the discovery by some teachers that I had dyslexia, I was able to do the work that I needed to do to get back on track and then be able to have the kind of life that I've had. So, I think a lot about kids in America that don't have the benefit of those kind of interventions early on. And then later, I had an amazing experience, which is I became the superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, which is a district of 95,000 kids, 57% Latino, 20% African American, and 20% Anglo, most of whom are living on free and reduced lunch, coming from a background of poverty. And that was the job that I was in before I was in the Senate. I think the reason early childhood education is so important is that kids, if they don't have a good early start, they actually start dropping out in elementary school, not when they get to high school. If you look at the studies, if you're a kid from poverty and you haven't had the benefit of preschool and you go to kindergarten, you will have heard on average 30 million fewer words than the more affluent kid in your class. Not than all the kids, not 30 million. That's what one wealthier kid has heard before they get to middle school. And kindergarten, ask any kindergarten teacher whether that makes a difference, and they'll tell you that it does. So that's why I've proposed a plan that includes funding not just full day for 4-year-olds, but we've got to find a way in this country basically to get back to birth and before birth so that parents know how important early education is and scaffolding vocabulary is. And I think until we do that, we're going to have a very hard time closing the achievement gap in this country. We've seen around the country that if there's a early literacy program that touches kids really when they're born. I mean, the best programs are ones where they meet with parents before the child is born. They give the parents books, and the books are then in the house, which they otherwise wouldn't be. And then there are home visits that people make to make sure that parents know how they can work with kids, even if they themselves aren't literate. It makes a difference. And any exposure that kids can have to vocabulary before they get to kindergarten is a big help. And we don't focus enough on it. Yeah, well, I'd say as a general matter, what people should know about our education system as a whole, the lack of early childhood education, the lack of equity in our K-12 system, and the lack of quality in our K-12 system, and the incredible inequities that exist with respect to going on to higher ed. If you take all that together, I'm sad to say this, but it's true, our education system is actually reinforcing the economic inequality we have in this country, rather than liberating kids from their economic circumstances. That hasn't always been true. There was a time in the middle of the 20th century when education really was the wind at our backs, and I think we can do that again. In fact, I think we have to do it again, because if we don't, we're going to lose the democracy. I mean, if you just take the academic outcomes for kids and extrapolate the changing demographics over the next half century in this country, if we don't start changing outcomes for kids, we're not going to recognize ourselves as a democracy or as an economy in the middle of the 21st century. It's that serious. That's why everybody needs to care about this. This isn't just about moms and dads, who have their own kids, or it's not about being, late in life and this no longer is of concern to you. This needs to be a concern of every single American, because the future of the democracy depends on our getting this right. I mean, the founders of this country, they didn't do everything well, and they perpetuated human slavery, which is going to be with us for the rest of our days, and the effects of which show up in the unequal school systems that we have today in the 21st century. But they did do some things right, and they had some intuitions that turned out to be right. First of all, they did not believe that the point of being in a democracy is that we would all agree with each other. The point of being in what they called a republic was that we would disagree with each other. And out of those disagreements, we would create more durable and more imaginative solutions than any king or tyrant could come up with on their own. And that's what pluralism is. That's what it's all about. It's at the core of our democracy. And a person can't participate meaningfully in that, or as meaningfully as they could, if they're not educated. And the founders knew that. They understood it. I mean, the origins of our public schools is a story of our democracy. And what made sense to them at the time was that they were going to do it based on property taxes because everybody lived in town, and the richest people paid most and the poorest people paid the least, and everybody's kids went to the same school. 230 years later, the country doesn't look anything like that anymore, but that still is the way we finance our school systems. And they would be concerned that that today in America, the best predictor of the quality of your education is your parents' income, because that ratifies the income inequality that we have, as I said, rather than liberating people from it. And that's really bad for the democracy, because the democracy can't exist if you have no economic mobility and if you've got massive income inequality, which is what we have. We've had 50 years of no economic mobility. You add on top of that an education system that's reinforcing that lack of mobility, that's a huge problem. On the other hand, if you have an education system that's liberating people from it, that's the most important thing you can do for democracy. And that really is what's at stake. It's common for people to say at this moment in our political history that our democracy is at risk because of Donald Trump, and I believe that. But I think our democracy is also at risk because we've got an education system that's not preparing people for the 21st century. It's really important for us to know our own history, because there's a tendency, if we don't know our own history, not to know all the challenges that Americans have solved before we showed up here. I mean, there are a lot of things that we're not doing now because other Americans dealt with it, like inventing high school, for example. There was a time in American history when you could support a family on a middle school education, and we discovered and decided in the early part of the 20th century that was no longer what was going to equip people for the 20th century. People needed a high school education. And today, I would argue that we've got to reinvent high school again, just as high school was invented 100 years ago. We need to think it through again so that kids that graduate from high school are able to earn a living wage when they finish, not just the minimum wage. There's no reason why a kid graduating from high school shouldn't graduate with a year of community college under their belt and with the ability to earn a living wage under their belt. Today, they don't, because we don't do that in high school. But we could change the way our community colleges intersect with our high schools and with employers in regions. And I think we could produce millions and millions of high school graduates who could earn a living wage, which would transform our economy. So that's one piece of business. And the other piece of business we got to do is we've got to make sure that there's equitable access to higher education, because the one thing that can really get you from being at the bottom of the income scale to being at the top of the income scale is a quality four-year education, but today, college education. But today, if you're born poor, your chances of getting such a degree are about 9 in 100. I often give that speech on the floor of the Senate where, we have 100 seats there, 100 desks, and I say if these desks represented poor kids in America, just these 9 would be college graduates. 91, all these other seats would be people that didn't receive a degree or the equivalent of a degree just because they were born poor and the way our system works. And I often say on the floor, if the United States Senate or the members of the Senate face those kind of odds for our own kids, everybody there would resign and go home and fix the problem. We've been treating America's kids like they're someone else's kids. They're not someone else's kids. They're America's kids. And once we begin to recognize that fact, I think we're going to be surprised at how much progress we can make. So we know from the data shows us that that people of color are much more burdened by student loans than white borrowers are. We also know that a lot of the people that are burdened by those loans never actually got their degree. So it's the worst of all possible worlds. All you were trying to do is get a college degree, and then you can't get through, because you can't afford to do it, or you can't afford housing, or you can't afford transportation, or childcare, which is a huge issue. I don't know why we don't have childcare centers on every single community college campus in this country, but we don't. And so it's a struggle. So people at the bottom of the economy that are trying to get themselves somewhere else are most likely to fall behind. The most important thing we can do is make college less expensive. It has become ridiculously expensive. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, which we can talk about if you're interested, but we got to fix that problem. And because I think people ought to be able to graduate from college essentially debt-free. And certainly if your family's making $75,000 or less, you should be able to get out of college debt-free. I don't think it has to be free, but I think that people want to get out of, we need to get people out of there debt-free, because if you don't, you end up creating all kinds of other problems, which is people who can't teach because they can't afford to pay back their student loans, or get stuck in their parents' basement, or can't start a small business because they're getting eaten up by student loans. It is a real crisis in this country. One of the issues people have to understand is that a lot of folks are, because of the expense of college, aren't getting through to begin with. So they're borrowing all this money. They don't get the benefit of the degree. So they're essentially in the same position they were in before they went to school, except now they have this college debt. So that's bone crushing. And it's even true with community colleges. 95% of the people that go to community college don't finish their degree, and they leave there with debt. So everything we can do to reduce the cost of college, to increase the availability of things like Pell Grants so that people don't have to rely on debt, would make a difference. And by the way, everybody should understand this isn't their fault. I mean, we used to live in a country where we, the taxpayers, supported higher education. We, the taxpayers, don't support higher education anymore. And that's why what we've said is, if you want a college degree, we've got a way for you to pay for it, which is you got to finance it through debt under really onerous circumstances. So now in Colorado, for example, there are a lot of people that go to the University of Colorado, and they're not going to be done paying their debt back for 25 or 30 years. Doesn't make any sense. One thing I really believe, having been a school superintendent, is this: I wish preschoolers voted. Because if preschoolers voted, we'd vote on the preschool agenda, and instead of pandering to other people, we'd be pandering to preschoolers. And essentially what preschoolers are saying to us is, you better not be the first generation of Americans to leave less opportunity, not more, to the people that are coming after us. And what that requires is that we fund education, that we pay attention to education, that we have universal pre-K, that a kid's zip code shouldn't determine the K-12 school that they go to, that people should be able to graduate from high school able to make a living wage, or go to college without bankrupting their family. Nobody's expecting more than that, but that should be a reasonable set of expectations for people to have in this democracy. After all, we don't pick our own parents. We don't know if we're going to be born poor or we're going to be born rich. And if we're going to have a democracy that's not just a society where you've got an aristocracy passing itself off to the next aristocracy and a whole bunch of other people that don't have the chance to participate meaningfully in the democracy or meaningfully in the economy, we're going to have to change what we do. This is really, really hard stuff. I mean, I've seen it at the local level, and I'm the first to say, we still have huge achievement gaps in Denver that I'm deeply worried about. On the other hand, Stanford just did a study that said that the kids in Denver are now growing so much faster than academically than the kids in the rest of the state. It's as if they have 60 additional school days a year compared to the kids in the rest of the state. That's a lot on 180 days of school. And what that tells me is this is really possible. And if we had a president who thought about the agenda that preschoolers want and got up in the morning, as I do, I mean, that's the way I think about it, I think we'd be attacking not just the education issues, but we'd be focused on ending childhood poverty in this country. I have a plan that would cut childhood poverty by 40% in 1 year. For the life of me, I don't understand why that's not the focus of our primary this time, because that's where opportunity will be created. And if you can lift kids out of poverty, good things happen to their education. All of these things are related to one another. And it's challenging because a lot of the system we have was designed 300 years ago in colonial America or before that. We don't live in an agrarian society anymore. And we're going to have to come to grips with that. The good news is that this 21st century economy of ours is screaming at us about how important it is to have a quality education, both a higher education and a quality high school education. And I think in the end, as Americans always do, we'll respond to it. But it's got to be a priority. It can't be an afterthought. And then just to the point you were talking about earlier about racial disparities, one of the most deeply depressing statistics I know is that if, on average, if you are an African American with a college degree, on average, you make less money than a white American with a high school diploma. And that's when we live in a country where on average, people that have a college degree make far more money than people with just a high school degree. It shows you the ways in which race, these issues are still ones we've got to contend with, because the unfairness is palpable.